Welcome to another episode of Jay Leno's Garage. This is going to be kind of an extended one today because this is, let's call this a special edition one, because we're dealing with a car that was, well, a car that I lusted after since I was 14 years old. This is the Chrysler Turbine car, 1963. We are going to do a road test. We'll drive the car. We'll show you what it sounds like, what it feels like on the road. I'm going to show you some vintage footage that has very rarely been seen about the first turbine car being shipped over from Ghia in Italy. We'll show you a promotional film that's just very 60s, you know, a film that was shot in the time when America could do anything, go to the moon, build jet cars, and it's when Chrysler was really, I think, in its heyday. And we also have a book review as well. A friend of mine, Steve Leto, wrote a book about this turbine car, and I did the foreword for the book. Well, here's Steve and I doing the book review. Check this out. This is Steve Leto. He's author of Chrysler's Turbine Car, The Rise and Fall of Detroit's Coolest Creation. I first got involved with the turbine car in 1964. I was 14 years old. I went to the World's Fair specifically to see this car, and they had it in a pit going around and around. Did you see it as well?
No, I didn't see it there, but I saw it.
That's right, you weren't even born. You were like 3.
I was 2 at the time.
You was 2. Right. I was 14. And I was so taken with the car, just the sound it made and how cool it looked, and it really seemed like the future. And I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to obtain one of these cars. There's only 2 of them in private hands, and I can attest that it's a really exciting automobile. On the cover is a man named Bill Kerry. He is the guy who was one of the engineers on this project originally, wasn't he?
He got to, yeah, he's the one who got to repair them when they broke down.
Right,
the most knowledgeable technician when it comes to turbine cars probably alive today.
So tell us how you got involved with the project and what brought you to write the book.
Well, I grew up in Detroit, and as a small child, I remember seeing these cars on the road, and then they disappeared, and always wondering what happened to them. Yeah. And that's the amazing story, is that at one point in time, there were 55 cars, 54 of them this exact same color, identical cars. Right. And then a few years later, they actually rounded them all up and destroyed them. Right, and that's the kind of thing that really gets you as a car lover. Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, because of various laws, and I think they were afraid that people would pull the turbine engines out and put a Hemi in them and all this kind of stuff and ruin the purity of the whole design. So they decided, you know, they did the same thing with the EV1 electric car. I mean, EV1 electric, the big 3 are famous for destroying their prototypes. And even though they built a fleet of them, they considered the whole fleet, in essence, a prototype experiment. Interesting, when these cars were decommissioned, they were offered to museums all around the country, and no museums wanted them because at the time they were fairly new cars. A man named George Hubner, am I saying his name right? Yeah, George Hubner was sort of the whole brains behind the turbine car. Yeah, and he was the guy, he was an extroverted engineer, if there's such a thing. Yeah. And he was so good at promotion, he realized that every time he took one of these cars out, it would cause a commotion. What they did was 203 people were given the car for 3 months. And they were to sort of keep a diary and tell about their experiences with the car. The idea was to put a jet car out on the market. The advantages were it would burn any fuel. When they took this car to Mexico, they ran it on tequila. When they took it to Paris, they ran it on the Chanel No. 5 Chanel No. 5 perfume. The car will run with any fuel that burns with oxygen. But see, back in 1964, that was not really an advantage because gas was 23 cents to 27 cents a gallon. And for most people, the fact that it was an alternative fuel vehicle was actually a deterrent. It has 1 spark plug. You never need to change the oil or anything because it doesn't get contaminated. There's no warming up process. It was pretty amazing. I mean, think back to 1964 when places like China and other places in Asia and around the world, they barely had piston engines. They barely had internal combustion engines. Here were Americans driving around in jet cars, just like the Jetsons, essentially. The rest of the world was the Flintstones, and America was the Jetsons. Trouble with the car was, I think, the fuel mileage was not great. On the highway, it would get about 19 miles per gallon, which is pretty good. But around town, it would just be awful because it's idling at 22,000 RPM. Just like a jet, it would just suck fuel. So that was a major, major disadvantage. People ask me, how fast is it? It's about the same as like a 318 Chrysler. It was not meant to be a race car. It was not meant to be a high-performance car. It was meant to be a practical, usable vehicle. Trouble why it didn't go forward was, as I said, upcoming emissions, because jets are very dirty. And
it was expensive to produce. In terms of producing jet engines and turbine engines, it was quite cheap. But against an internal combustion engine, it was expensive. And quite frankly, it wasn't that much better. It's kind of like the Wankel engine now. The Wankel engine is lighter and smoother than a piston engine, but the fuel mileage is not very good. So consequently, it never really moved forward. It's got to be better in all aspects. It can't be even equal.
And at that exact moment that those things all happened, Chrysler hit their first financial bad spot.
Exactly.
And we forget that Chrysler, although they went bankrupt a few years ago, also had trouble in the late 60s and early 70s. And when they made the choice, are we going to tool up to mass produce these cars or not, they couldn't, even if they had wanted to.
Now, before we drive the car, we're getting there. Let me show you the footage that I was talking about a little bit earlier. This is the very first turbine car coming from Italy. Once again, I want to thank Mark Olson for this extremely rare bit of tape here. What you're seeing is the very first production turbine car body. It's January 1963, and this is the first of 55 hand-built bodies from Ghia of Italy. The executives and the engineers all look on while the lab workers use hammers and crowbars to open this huge crate. The first 5 bodies were delivered to Highland Park to be used for final adjustment and testing. There they are pushing the top off. These first 5 were prototypes and were not at all identical to the bodies used for the program deliveries. There's the Ghia insignia right there from Italy. Now that black cloth was put over the body to protect it from auto paparazzi outside the fence trying to get a complete photo of the car as they uncrated it. Now this very first body had a black interior, and the most prominent difference were the emblems on the rear of the car that identified it as a Typhoon. That was the name of the 2-seat non-functional prototype turbine car that looked a lot like the final 4-seat version that was finally delivered to the users. Now one of these first 5 was painted all white and was in a movie called The Lively Set. James Darren, there you go, Typhoon. James Darren played a race car driver. You got to see The Lively Set. You got to buy it. I've seen this movie 50 times just to see the turbine car. Here's the poster. Well, here's that movie I talked about, The Lively Set. There's Doug McClure. There's James Darren. Randy Newman actually did the music for this film. Look, they live these thrills. They made the turbine car look a little different. And in the film, you know, the turbine car beats all the piston engine cars because it's lighter and faster and all that kind of stuff. But if you want to see some footage of the turbine car in action, it's pretty good from that point of view. But you know, it's just one of those 60s kind of movies. It's a little silly. Well, here, let's get back to our footage. Notice everybody's wearing a hat. Men in hats. There you go. We're all sort of marveling at the turbine engine there. Now here is a glimpse of the only turbine car assembly line in the history of the automobile. This plant was located just north of I-96 on the Greenfield Road near Detroit, Michigan. Now Lynn Townsend is a gentleman in a lighter brown suit. He's the president of Chrysler Corporation, and he's being shown around the plant by George Hubner, again the genius behind the whole turbine car deal. Robert Brown is another unidentified executive in there. I'm not sure which one he is. But Greenfield is where this all came together. This is where the bodies were shipped from Italy and connected with the engines built in the engineering lab at Highland Park. See that the engine, transmission, suspension, brakes, steering were all assembled in a single unit mounted on a rolling stand. That assembly could then be moved under the raised body and attached with just 4 huge bolts. Now all the electrical equipment and rear suspension is assembled to the bodies as well. Work progressed at the rate of about 1 finished turbine car per week. So these were truly handmade automobiles. 1 car a week. I mean, Henry Ford used to make one every, 30 minutes, something like that. So that shows you the amount of care that went into the assembly of these cars. Now you're going to see Mr. Townsend get into a finished turbine car and drive it off the assembly line. Pretty cool piece of history. From there, I went to the Chrysler Motor Division for break-in and adjustments before it was delivered to the first users. Now, the next piece of tape you're going to see, this is really great. Again, I thank Mark Olson. This is a Chrysler promotional film, and I just like the narrator's voice and that whole 60s attitude like we can do anything.
Yes, the Chrysler Turbine car, as man moves forward.
Over a decade of research and testing had evolved the most advanced, most practical gas turbine engine ever specifically designed for automobiles. But now that this engineering achievement is here, perhaps it would be well to consider just what is a turbine. What is a turbine? Actually, a turbine is a highly advanced use of one of man's oldest means for creating power to do work, the windmill. The windmill, as most of us know it, consists of a number of curved blades called vanes mounted on an axle. A breeze blowing against these vanes causes the windmill to turn and to supply power to do many kinds of jobs. As the wind increases, the windmill spins faster, provides more power. The turbine, acting as a controlled windmill, makes today's jet airplanes possible. But its use in a passenger automobile is substantially different. First, we'll lift the hood on the gas turbine car for a look at the engine. Now, looking down on the engine, we can, through the use of animation, get a clearer picture of how the turbine engine works. To perform efficiently the functions of an automotive power plant, Chrysler Corporation's gas turbine was designed with these main units: air compressor, combustion chamber, first turbine wheel for compressor drive, second turbine wheel for driving the car, regenerators or heat exchangers. The air compressor sucks in outside air and compresses or squeezes it to raise its pressure. Compressing the air raises its temperature to more than 425 degrees Fahrenheit. This compressed hot air flows through the regenerator where it is further heated to more than 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Then into the combustion chamber into which the fuel is sprayed. The fuel, ignited by a single spark plug, is burned and further raises the air temperature to 1,700 degrees. Then this now red-hot tornado of air or gas forces its way past the blades of the first turbine, whose job it is to turn the air compressor, regenerators, oil pump, fuel control, and other necessary accessories to make your car function. The hot gas then turns the second turbine, which is connected to the rear wheels to drive your car. But that isn't the whole story of the turbine engine's operation. Two other major elements make the gas turbine engine practical for use in a passenger car. After leaving the combustion chamber and passing through the two turbine wheels, there is a dip in the temperature of the gases as they flow to the exhaust. But the gases retain large amounts of heat, which would be wasted if merely allowed to escape unhindered through the exhaust pipe to blister the paint of cars following. So a device for salvaging this heat is placed in the path of the outrushing gases. This is the famous Chrysler-originated Rotary Regenerator, which is basically a heat exchanger. To more easily understand the role of the regenerator, let us take a closer look. To do the job, the regenerators turn slowly, transferring heat energy from the exhaust gases through special heat transfer surfaces to the high-pressure cooler air being pushed by the compressor on its way to the burner. This eases the burner's job of raising the gas's temperature on their way to the turbines. This preheated air requires less fuel and permits the turbine to develop fuel economy comparable to a piston engine. In the Chrysler turbine, the air itself is turned by special curved blades called nozzle vanes. These vanes change their position to direct the stream of hot gas against the turbine blades at different angles. Economy for cruising, or greater power for acceleration, or even a braking effect for slowing and stopping. In spite of the increased efficiency of the engine, the gas turbine is simplicity itself. It has only about 1/5 as many moving parts as the common piston engine. Because it is self-cooled, the turbine needs no radiator nor antifreeze. There are no timed events in the turbine engine, no need for a distributor nor a carburetor. There are no tappets, no valves. Finally, no pistons rushing up and down in their individual cylinders. In the turbine engine, you have a smoothly efficient operating system which burns almost any available fuel. Unleaded gasoline, kerosene, diesel fuel, jet fuel. You have no low temperature starting difficulties, no engine warm-up period necessary.
battery in the trunk is pretty common now, but back in the 60s, it was pretty unorthodox. Here's your battery pack in here. So you've got two 12-volt batteries, and it's important you keep those charged up because this thing takes a lot of energy to charge. Got your spare tire, very conventional trunk. The rear end of this thing is my favorite. Just a styling tour de force, as I might say. It's just this side of being excessive, but I just love the look of the rear of this thing. And let's go into the hood. There it is right there. This is that big air filter I was talking about earlier that keeps everything quiet. As you can see, this is some kind of cast iron alloy. It doesn't look like any jet engine I've ever seen. You have got all these 60s type connectors on here. You got engine hour meter there. All right, we're about ready to take it for a drive, but first you got to hear it start. That's the coolest part. I want to show you how smooth this engine is. As you can see, the water doesn't move at all. What movement there is just the residual effect of me putting the glass down. But look at that. Look how smooth that is. Pretty amazing. Suddenly, it's 1964. As you can hear, it's fairly quiet inside the car. It's actually very quiet inside the car. I love the dashboard, very Porsche-like with the three big dials there. Tachometer, notice she idles at 22,000 RPM. First thing I did was fix the clock. I like to have everything work. Speedometer, fuel gauge, radio works. Radio works good. And then you got your classic 60s. If you watch the show Mad Men, people love to smoke. Got a little water damage here. I've got to clean that. I like where it says Turbine Power by Chrysler Corporation. See a little piece of gold trim. That gold should go all the way around the inside of this wheel, and we will put that on there when we get some more of the gold tape. This is my favorite interior styling element. You know, when this was the auto show, people thought this is where the jet exhaust came down the center of the car. Not true. I mean, there are turbine blades front and back to give it the look of a turbine car. This is your gear lever here for reverse, and these are your lights. These are your wipers, the blower switch, and the rear defroster, interior lights. The car has electric windows, which was considered a big la-di-da item back in the 60s. Most people still had roll-up windows. This whole pillarless coupe thing, when you put down that rear window, I think it looks very, very elegant. And you have your adjustable outside mirror from the inside as well. This is all an original car. And since I got it from Chrysler, I am the first owner. So I am the original owner of this car, which is kind of fun. Of course, you never really own cars like this. You just sort of become the custodian. You know, you try to save it and preserve it for the next person. In fact, when I got it, I had a lot of dings up and down the side of the car, just from opening it in parking lots and doors hitting against it and whatnot. And a buddy of mine was one of those dent master places, you know, and he came out with his little tools, bing, 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 took out all the dents, never harmed the original paint or anything. So I'm not quite sure this is the original paint. I think this might have been retouched up by Chrysler over the years, but it's certainly the original paint that was used, and it was done by Chrysler. So for that sense, I'll call it original. Just enough of a turbine whine noise to make it interesting, but almost like an electric car in its smoothness. I mean, this thing was so far ahead of its time. I can't imagine any manufacturer trying an experiment as bold as this these days. Everything else is fairly traditional. Look, your turbine car starting procedure. It says turn off engine if temperature exceeds 1600 degrees. Engine temperature is going to drop off within 2 minutes and stabilize near 1400. Must be below 1500 before attempting to move, or flame out will occur. This engine tends to run just a little bit hotter. I think there's some kind of carbon seals that allow air to come in, and I think that makes it run a little bit hotter than it should. But it's not bad. It seems okay. It seems okay. But everything else is pretty much 60s Chrysler. As I said, it uses a torque flight transmission. It just uses the turbine as the torque converter. You could do burnouts in this car. You have to torque load it. What that means, you put your foot on the brake, get the revs up, and then take your foot off the brake. But I don't want to do that to either the engine blades or the transmission. But that little movie you saw, that kind of explained how the whole thing worked. I'm always amazed at how many car guys I meet in their 30s and 40s that never heard of this car. What is that? I mean, this is a real piece of automotive history. I think it's probably one of the most important post-war American cars of all time, because it was designed from the ground up to be totally different. Although it uses many stock Chrysler components, like brakes and essentially the transmission, the whole idea behind it was so revolutionary at the time, and still is. And I think it's a beautiful looking automobile, not overly styled. It doesn't look like a jet car, you know, with bubble roofs and all that kind of stuff. It just looks, I think, very elegant and very restrained, especially for the period. To this day, this car still turns heads. I still get a thrill every time I take this car out. Even though this car is almost 50 years old, it just feels like this is where we should have been by now. Smooth, quiet, the most incredible heater you can imagine. You turn the heater on in this thing, especially if you're in Detroit, you turn the heater on in 2 minutes, the whole car would be defrosted. But the exhaust coming out the back is quite cool, as we mentioned earlier. You know, there's a lot of myths about the Chrysler Turbine car. Some of them actually make me angry. I read in a popular automobile magazine that the reason the Chrysler Turbine car wasn't produced was, well, at stoplights, they would melt the asphalt, or they would set the grass on fire if you're on a dirt road. Nothing could be further from the truth. Chrysler worked very hard to make sure the exhaust from these engines was actually cooler than a piston engine vehicle. About 140 degrees. They used regenerators to recirculate the hot gases until they were cool enough to come out of the exhaust. There was real thinking behind this car. That's why Chrysler has always been the engineering company. What this thing was meant to be was just an incredible highway cruiser. Let's take it up on the freeway and see what she does. And this car is exactly as it left the factory, right down to the bias ply tires. You know, I was going to put radials on it, but Bill Carey said, no, 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 you can't. It's got to ride like it did when it was new. And you get that classic sort of Chrysler Boulevard ride. But the bias plies aren't bad. Obviously, this is not a car you're going to do a burnout with. And since there are no parts available for this engine, I like to drive it fairly easily. So 70, 75 miles an hour, that's a good speed for this. She'll do well over that, but I don't want to take it much higher than that. These were ready to go into production, but sadly, because of the price and upcoming emissions, it just wasn't deemed viable. But it was great to see a company like Chrysler take a chance on something like this. Well, as you can tell, this video was a little bit longer than the other ones because, well, there's a lot more story to tell. Steve's book is terrific. Steve Leto, thank you so much for writing the book and asking me to do the forward. And Mark Olson, thanks for carrying this flame all these years. You know, it just amazed me. I brought Mark out and he got to drive the car as well. He hadn't been in one since he was 15 years old. So that was kind of cool. So, as I said, I hope you enjoyed this little trip in the turbine car as much as I did. And it's fun to be able to preserve history like this and get it on the road and take it to car shows where people can see it and hear it, because, you know, it's not till you see a vehicle like this in relationship to other vehicles. You know, they look fine when you go to an auto show, but when you see them on the road next to Toyotas and all these kind of cars, you go, wow, that thing is pretty cool. So anyway, thanks for being a part of history today, and I hope you enjoyed the ride. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks.